Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to Mara's October Jam. And today, on 19th of October, we are having a weekly talk. And we have very two important guests talking about culture and what role it plays in the current political formation and from two different perspectives. And I just want to set a very brief context before introducing our speakers. The way we see culture, it's a very broad word and it's a very contested word. And as we'll see from the speakers also, there are equally divergent ways of being critical about the word. But to give a very broad perspective of where we are coming from as hosts of this talk, we see culture as a network of shared meanings that circulate in any given society. And those shared meanings are created through representational systems. They are symbolic systems, they are material systems. And those representational systems include television, cinema, language, even language itself. And in those, there are many significant meaning making systems and significant representations that somehow survive the test of time. They manage to stick in populations, they manage to create affect, they manage to mobilize emotions. And those are what we accord the status of myth, or those are what stick on in a civilization as rites and rituals and epics and so on and so forth. And they have a slightly distinct status from the more mundane everyday banal kind of rituals or the little gods and goddesses that are localized, whereas the significant ones manage to travel across the significant, geography, across time, and so on and so forth. So that's one way of giving a fairly broad but um, descriptive and neutral idea of culture. But of course, the terrain on which culture is operating is not an even terrain. It's a very uneven terrain, a terrain rife with power struggle, a terrain rife with historical forms of inequality, discrimination, violence, all of which I need not go into. But the question is, how does this whole cultural domain interact with or fit into this other domains which are highly uneven? Which could be in economic terms, which could be in political terms, which could be in ethnic terms, linguistic terms, and so on and so forth. So, in many terms, this terrain is highly uneven. And how does culture fit into that in order to kind of propagate or reinforce existing power struggles? In terms of subverting those power struggles, in terms of resisting those power struggles. Either way, culture is not or cannot be, in any sense, innocent of the wider kind of political developments that are going on. So, how do we think of aesthetics, culture, and arts, to broad three distinct but interrelated terms? How do they really fit into the political regime? That's really what we are going to be discussing today. And we have two different perspectives, of which I'm sure there'll be overlaps, but of course there might also be some differences. To begin, I'd like to introduce Arshia Sattar. She's the founder of Sangam House Writers Residency and a writer and a translator herself. With a PhD in South Asian languages and civilizations from University of Chicago, she's worked with Valmiki Ramayana for over 30 years, and she's particularly interested in the epics and storytelling traditions in the Indian subcontinent. And she teaches and writes about classical Indian literature in India and abroad. And our other speaker today is Brahma Prakash, who's a writer, cultural theorist, and the assistant professor of theatre and performance studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's also the author of Cultural Labour, Conceptualizing the Folk Performance in India, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019, and also the author of Body on the Barricades, Life, Art and Resistance in Contemporary India, which was published by LeftWord in 2023. Coming to his research interest, he's interested in regional cultural performance traditions from northern India with a special focus on the questions of aesthetics, marginality, and environmental and cultural justice. So, slightly different, but of course, a lot of overlap. So, Those are the two speakers. Now I'll hand over the floor to Arshia for her to speak first, and then we'll have Brahm. So over to you, Arshia.
Hi, people out there, people in here. um, so I want to thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. It's rare. And that is some kind of indication of where I sit in terms of all the domains and the larger cultural spaces that you spoke of. I think I have a perfectly reasonable, easy to pronounce name, but clearly it's exotic to a lot of people. Uh, I also very, very often experience a phenomenon by which my name is made more familiar. So I'm very often Asha, very often Harsha, very often Harshita, and if I'm really lucky, I get to Aisha. Yeah. So, but and that is it. That it has. When I was growing up in India, I never felt myself to be outside or marginal. But since the 90s, I began to feel that increasingly. And so I embrace this thing of like, you don't actually know my name. My surname, of course, Sattar becomes Sattar. Fair enough. But, it's a common enough Muslim name for people to have learned how to pronounce. But the fact is that we don't know Muslims, so we don't know how to call them. Yeah. Okay. I'm a textualist. I work very much with stories, and I work with texts. And Brahma, of course, is somebody who's on the barricades. So even though I think we share many perspectives and many ideological positions, and perhaps even texts, we share texts. If all of culture is a text, I think we come at them from two very, very, very different ways. So I have a bunch of things that I want to say today. I hope they're all related to each other, but it's very much in response to conversations that I had with Mara, what they were looking at, what October Jam is about. Very much this idea of repair, which I took to heart. I think it's a brilliant rubric for any organization to apply to its own work, but it's also a very important rubric for us to apply to our the situation in which we now find ourselves. So one of the things that I've noticed over the last couple of years and the last few months have cemented what I had been noticing, which is how much louder and how much longer festivals are becoming. Yeah, particularly Hindu festivals, festivals that used to be celebrated in the home. My mother-in-law, for example, she always did Varalakshmi Puja, always, 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 every year. But it was a home puja, and it was, people would visit each other. They would share, it's a very domestic celebration. And this year I noticed for the first time that Vara Lakshmi is out on the streets. There are big, rathas, there are big chariots. There's a lot of accompanying music and dance. And of course, there is the utilization of a lot of public space, right? Also, I think all of us can see, just from, looking at a newspaper, every month there is a new festival that we are called upon to celebrate. And, because this particular kind of nationalism is a handmaiden to capitalism, we are asked to celebrate not simply by, remembering God or thinking of our children, our families. No, we have to go by, right? So you need to wear clothes like this. Have you given your wife a gift this year? And there's this peculiar mixture of Western celebratory patterns and our own celebratory patterns, right? So that is something that I have noticed, and which it makes me uncomfortable because it really is an appropriation of public space, not simply roads and neighborhoods, but oral space and emotional space and capitalist space, I mean, capitalism should also have choices. I mean, that's what predication, capitalism is predicated on. I was also uh, very taken aback by what happened in the cricket match between India and Pakistan, and the recall of Operation Sindoor um, by sports people, and I will say this, male sports people. I think that's important. And how there is now, I believe, we are all feeling a pressure to perform Hinduism, and we are feeling a pressure to perform nationalism. Yeah, you are anti-national, you are anti-national. Why are you wearing these clothes? Why are you saying like that? Why are you reading this book? Whatever, right? So there are certain ways in which we are expected to be, and in order to righteously and rightfully occupy public spaces, we need to behave in certain ways. So our cricket captain, I used to watch cricket, I don't anymore. So I have very little to say about this young man. Had it been 10 years ago, I said, oh, no, 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 I can't say all those things. But I was very, very, very struck by the patriotism that was on display, and along with that patriotism of, like, I'm not going to shake your hand and whatever, the bizarre demonization of the Asia Cup chairman, whoever that Pakistani gentleman was. Um, he took the cup home. It's like, what is he going to do? Is he going to leave it on the field for somebody else to pick up? No, I think he was just making a nice gesture. But it was blown up into a gesture of childishness, a gesture of pettiness. So yeah, it was. I was struck and disturbed by how how prevalent this has become. Um, the other thing that happened this last month is we had a beautiful Purnima, October Purnima, which I grew up knowing it as a Sharad Purnima, but now it is Valmiki Purnima, right? And I'm really, really glad that the Purnima does not have a Savarna name, right? I'm delighted that it is not an upper caste appropriation of the Purnima, but um, why? Is it because we are Buddha Purnima? Is that why we must have a Valmiki Purnima? And then is there a Dvaipayana Vyasa Purnima going to come? And Sharad Purnima it celebrates the beginning of the sweet winter. It says goodbye to the rains. It's a harvest moon. But now it is named for a particular person who I actually am deeply attached to, because I study Valmiki Ramayana. So if I have an idol for how to write a story, it would be Valmiki. Um, so there are so many ways of othering, and it's, of course, minorities are being othered, but I think that even within the larger domain of what has come to be called Hinduism, look at Sudhamurti. Yeah, first she told us that she always carries her own spoon, because suppose the spoon in the dish, suppose the spoon has touched knowledge, those were her exact words. Yeah, now she's not answering the caste census, because we are not low caste people, right? It's really, Sudha, if you hadn't told me, I would never have known. Looking at your face, it's hard to tell. Right? We also have a finance minister, Nirmala Sitaraman. I don't know about the price of onions because we don't use them in our house. Right? So even in the seemingly innocent remarks that are coming out of the mouths of women, look at the subtext. Yeah? Um, Again, to come back to the way Hinduism is occupying more and more space in our popular culture, in our public spaces. When I was growing up, I was very lucky to have grown up in many different parts of the country. I lived in Calcutta when I was a child, years in Bombay, in Maharashtra and Pune and all of that. And Durga Puja was a Bangla festival. Yeah. And Ganapati was a Marathi festival. Okay. It was the joy of it. Right? But like, oh my God, this is Ganapati Bappa's time. It was so local. It was started by Tilak. It was started for reasons of nationalism. Durga Puja is for the goddess, for Christ's sake. What could be better than that for a young girl growing up in Calcutta? Navratri is God. Now everybody is celebrating everything. I have spoken about my mother lives there. There is a garden that takes her to school. It's my polling booth. What was so many festivals are celebrated there. But this year, Ganpati, but there is a not like okay. This is new. Yeah, you see also in Bangalore how much Ganpati. Of course, here we don't say Ganpati, we say Ganesha. Yeah, which, as you pointed out, is a pan-Indian. It's not a Desha way of talking about our beloved God. It's a very Marga way of referring to pan-Indian Sanskritized gods. Oops. Okay. So the regional is becoming the national. Kavadiyas, right? Kavadiyas are not new. I remember one of my teachers told me, I don't know why you're getting so upset about Kavadiyas. They were there from when I was a little boy, when I used to live in Barabanki. It's like, no, nobody's saying that they were born yesterday. But look at the amount of public space they occupy. Not simply physical space, but emotional space, newspaper space, media space. Yeah? And again, they are entitled. They believe that they are entitled to this space, right? And again, there is an othering, this demand that all shop owners, eating houses, the people who owned, as we say, hotels, their names had to be on the board, on the route that the Kavadiyas were taking. Now, what are they looking for? Is it a Muslim place? Is it a Dalit run place? Yeah. But the separations are coming thick and fast. They're coming from all directions. So there's another. I a little bit want to talk about my own work as well. But there's one. So. Many of us have grown up on Amar Chitra Katha, right? And how much we love those stories. And also we grew up on Tinkle and Janna Mama and all, depending on what generation we're. But, okay, so that's the one thing. I want you to keep Amar Chitra Katha in your mind. But the other thing I want to talk about is civic religion, right? Because for many of us who are atheists, we are accused of having civic religion. That is, we worship the Constitution, we worship Parliament, all that. And there are civic rituals. There is Republic Day Parade, rah, 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 nation. There is also like extremely beautiful things like Independence Day. So there are spaces of civic religion. Now, those spaces are actually being taken out of the secular system and given very, very clear. I'm sorry, I'm very stuck on this word performative today, right? But they have very, very clear performance paradigms. Look at the opening of the new parliament. Yeah. The symbolisms and the semiotics, of what was happening there are extremely clear to anybody who is willing to read between the lines, as it were. There is, yeah. So, but what I wanted to say about Amar Chitra Katha is one of the first places where, as children, the difference between myth and history is dissolved. Right, so Amar Chitra Katha is telling you about Krishna and Mahabharata and Indra and Ahalya and this one and that one, and in the same series, Sant Tukaram, Sant Kabir, Ambedkar, yeah. So as a child, you are already, there's a susceptibility created in your mind that there really isn't a difference between myth and history, that the past is the past, that it's undifferentiated in terms of truth, well, let's not say truth, in terms of fact and possibility and story, right? So, and this is what civic religion builds on, this idea that we don't care if this is true or not, right? That they both form us. And of course, there are the other problems with Amachitra Katha, which everybody has noticed, that like Dalit caste people are always very dark, Muslims have green faces, the outsiders got badi badi mooche, like the lambe lambe bar, Rakshasas, Muslims, Dalit people, we all look alike. And then of course there are the Shakuntalas and the Alyas and the Sita Devis who don't look like any one of us actually. But what I do want to say is all of this makes our small acts or big acts of resistance all the more important and all the more significant, right? And we cannot imagine that resistance started with us, right? That it's because we are living in a situation which makes us uncomfortable. Oh, we are resisting. Oh, we are postmodern. Oh, we are post-colonial. We are the ones that, rubbish. Yeah, people are, Jainism and the Upanishads. Forget Jainism and Buddhism. The Upanishads, which are considered really, really to be the heart of Hinduism, among most beautiful texts. In the tradition. They started as opposition to Brahminical hegemony in the Vedic period, right? Jainism, Buddhism, Upanishads all developed at the same time. All of them were saying, too much ritual, let me think. Yeah. As it turned out, they separated their paths, and they, one emphasized this, one emphasized that, one emphasized the other. But the idea of the Atman, the idea of moksha, all of this started in response to the control that Brahmins had over not simply your temporal life, but also your afterlife, your spiritual life. Yeah. So now that was 600 BC. So resisting is not new. For me, in the place that I work and in where I feel most comfortable, for me, resisting is actually providing alternative narratives, right? There are many, many ways to understand our world. There are many, many ways to see ourselves in history. There are many ways to see ourselves outside history. And it is those narratives that we have to look for. It is those narratives that we have to perpetuate. Those are the ones that we have to disseminate, we have to propagate, yeah? And one very easy way to have an alternative narrative is to take an old story and retell it in a way that you would like to. You retell the story in such a way that you see yourself in that story, right? That the story includes somebody like you. So we have so many, many writers now, men as well as women, younger and older people, people with good information, people with bad information, who are retelling the epics, right? That's great. But again, we give the agency of resistance, yeah, the agency to create resistance, we give it to ourselves by saying, I will retell the story. Yeah, okay, even before all our modern retellers, women's songs, women's stories from deeply, deeply traditional situations, from villages, old stories. There are songs about Sita and how sad she must be. Yeah. And these are songs that are sung, you will know about this, these are songs that are sung as girls leave home after they get married in the bidai case, bachchi ka kya hoga, itni dur ja rahi hai, So there are people who we think are not sophisticated. There are people who we think are uneducated. They are also performing resistance, right? And they are actually performing resistance by going back to the old text, not retelling it. Saying, "Arey, is kahani mein bhi, even in this story, yeah, Sita is asking questions." The greatest moment of resistance in our classical past is Draupadi. Yeah, when there's the Vastraharana, when she is disrobed in the assembly of the Kauravas, and what is this? Look at you, all you men. You are the great upholders of Dharma. What do you have to say about this? I, your daughter-in-law, the daughter-in-law of this family, I am being insulted in public, and you're just sitting on your hands, right? Now, that is not simply an act of, well, of course, it is an act of resistance, but it is also, it is calling into question the status quo, right? And that is enshrined in one of our classical stories. So, when we are told by people who have vested interests, oh, you must study the past, we must learn everything from the past. It's like, yeah, very good. I would love to have Draupadi's courage, right? And I would also like to have Sita's very, very quiet way of asking questions when they go to, the first time we meet Sita, right, in Valmiki Ramayana, first time she opens her mouth in Valmiki Ramayana, she's saying to Ram, but I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to come with you to the forest. Right? When they're in the forest, she tells him, put away your weapons. This is not a place for violence. Yeah, you will draw violence towards yourself, towards us, if you carry these weapons around, right? At the end of the story, at the very end of the story, when Rama says, come, prove your chastity, prove your innocence at my great Ashwamedha Yagna and all that. And she doesn't even look at him. When she did Agni Pariksha, she says, if I have been pure, let the fire protect me. When she calls on the earth to take her away, she doesn't even ask. She doesn't say, Dharti Mata, if I have been good, yeah, let everybody believe. She says, take me away. She says, if I have been pure, let me leave. Yeah. This is the Sita that I want to find. Yeah. This is a Sita that is in Sanskrit Valmiki, the first Ramayana that we have. So what we have to do also when we are looking for alternative narratives is we have to go back to the texts themselves, right? And we have to read them in ways that the patriarchy does not. Because we have been receiving patriarchal interpretations of how these stories should sit in our cultures. But guess what? That moment has passed, right? So yeah, I think I've said enough for now, and we can go back to.
Okay, thanks for that, Arshia. So, I thought like there were several things that she touched upon which we'll come back after Brahm's talk. But it was clear that there was a focus on the mythical aspect of culture, but also the increasing kind of imprint of a kind of politics on psychogeography, right? Which is increasingly in the media, increasingly in the public spaces, so harder to kind of not let it permeate the consciousness, so to speak. So there's also the contemporary element of how the past seeps into through festivals and through rituals and so on and so forth. So there's that whole network of things that are happening which Arshia referred to. But I know, Brahm, that you're also kind of working on other things that are signifying similar politics, but of a more contemporary nature. I know you're looking at like infrastructure, like JCBs, or like the electronic music, which once used to play in clubs, are now being remobilized under a different set of meanings. So there's this new kind of network of aesthetics, if you like, that are also in service of much of what Arshia was kind of saying. So maybe you could touch upon that and also any other things that you want to respond to what Arshia has said. So yeah, over to you, Brahm.
Thank you, Ram. Am I audible? Is it clear? Yeah. So thank you, Ram, and thank you, Arshia. You have almost provided the background, and really, it's almost a pleasure to hear you. It's a sheer honor that you are here, and I would like to thank friends at Mara to organize this talk and bringing us in conversation. So when they informed me, then I was really excited about having this dialogue. So I think precisely you have pointed out some of those crises that you are talking about. I think in terms of our reading, and in my readings, I am perhaps more oriented towards the contemporary crisis. And I think that my readings largely come with the contemporary, more contemporary and modern crisis, when texts are coming in a dialogue with nation, when text is coming in a dialogue with some kinds of new idea of the citizenship, when text is coming in dialogue with the whole idea of the affect that we are talking about. And that is what I read, that when I see Ramayana now, I have not I had this whole opportunity and some kinds of honor to have share this Ramayana kinds of readings with Paula Richman and Rustam Barucha. We both three of us used to take one component on Ramayana tradition and different interpretations. But I have some kinds of, so still some of those thoughts are still I'm working on, and many times I'm not also very clear the way it is unfolding. So either you are talking about, and that is the way I want to point out. So it is crisis of myth itself. What I'm really working on, that the way we used to perceive Ramayana perhaps in terms of some kinds of interpretation, that is not working. So first of all, what we are seeing, so either you are thinking about angry Hanuman. So I don't think people are really engaging with one or other interpretation. It is largely affect and attitude that becomes the way of engagement with these figures. Same way if you're thinking about, I don't think if you're thinking about many times, and that is the gap I am trying to find out in terms of scholars who are trying to provide different interpretation, and they're also having some kinds of very hopeful kinds of things, that okay, Ramayana have so many interpretation, Ramayana have so many alternatives, and perhaps that will save us. My challenge is that no, people are not reading Ramayana in that ways. In contemporary kinds of crisis, people are not reading Ramayana in that ways, and that brings us the first crisis. And first crisis is that not how to read something that is, and therefore also this challenge also comes that whenever we find either in terms of your writing, I have read some parts of not but also Rustam Barucha and the Paula Richmond will engage. It also some attempts at the level of a scholarship to bring some alternative kinds of interpretations. But I think in contemporary crisis, those interpretations are not giving us the answer. If you go to the field, the way either you are thinking about Hindutva pop, the way it is becoming a spectacle that you have talked about, it is becoming more a spectacular, it is more about effect, it is more about some kinds of trance. I don't think that, so I agree with many of the parts, because I also teach courses around myth, ritual and things, and I completely understand the power of the myth, the way complex things, it involves some kinds of complex thing. Ramayana has the whole tradition, one can talk about from here to Indonesia to different other parts of the world, Thailand and other parts of the world, and we have different interpretations. So that is only providing us one kinds of reading or perhaps one kinds of engagement. But in my reading, that is not enough. That we are lacking, that is creating a massive gap. And perhaps in lot many scholars, when I'm reading, they are not able to provide me that answer, that where lies the answer, how people are engaging with some kinds of figurations of Rama or figures of this Rama or Ramayana, that is just coming in terms of Jai Sri Ram slogan. Ramayana is just becoming a slogan, because I don't think people who understand even a bit of that slogan, that even they're interested in understanding that slogan, they're just interested in participating in that slogan, and that becomes one mode of departure or some kinds of things. So, and some parts of myth many times also becomes a fascination. I draw a lot from Susan Sontag, who writes about different kinds of myth, and the very fascination leads us to the aspect of fascism. So that fascination, that I also many times read a lot of myths. I work largely with the folk performances, with balletic kinds of performances, but many times those either you are thinking in terms of archetypal figures, or some kinds of a structure, various structures of feeling, then I think that in that way some of those problems. So why out of and that is my precisely some of those questions. So why out of hundreds and hundreds of interpretation of different other kinds of myth, Ramayana is becoming prominent after independence? And I think this is not the question that I would be interested in. Many anti-caste intellectuals, either you are thinking about Periyar, you are thinking about, I have been doing some recent work on anti-caste intellectuals and their engagement with this text. What has been their take on this text? And what I feel quite interesting about their engagement, that they engage, many times they engage with a very fascinating way. Their starting point is very fascinating. But after a point of time, they realized, or they have read the sign that this text is not going to provide us some kinds of emancipatory politics. And then at a point comes in all of their engagement where they try to disengage at the level of ridicule, disengage at the level of satire, that like suppose if you're thinking about like one can read Periyar's engagement with Ramayana as an interpretation, but I will say it was an act of disengagement, that somehow I want to get out of this text. I'm not interested in this text. I just want to throw out this text or this kinds of interpretation. And that becomes a kinds of like some kinds of I will say some kinds of discourse they provide us. So many times, and they get like many times, either you are reading Periyar, either you are reading Ambedkar, either you are reading many of those like Hindi scholars who was writing in regional language in Uttar Pradesh, in various parts of Bihar, and then you will find that like they are just trying to make some kinds of a speech act. They are engaging, but again there is a force they are coming with that. Oh no, I don't want to engage with text any longer. So what was this? Like one, that why out of these hundreds, out of the hundreds of texts or thousands of texts, if you're thinking in Indian kinds of context, then Ramayana is becoming the prominent text after independence. So, and this directly goes with some kinds of association with the nationalism, some kinds of association with the Hinduism, or Hinduism that is more associated with the nationalism, because I don't think in our time both can be separated in a kinds of clear-cut ways, and both go together, inform each other in that. So what I will provide some other kinds of readings. So what I say like mythicide, like many times, and I will give you more like because now we have Diwali. So I will name the first problem as a mythicide, killing by myths, like in how many of our local festivals, many of our local practices are getting killed by myths or these powerful myths that is really not only appropriating but completely and highlighting those myths. And so, for example, so, and you also have a scholar who is like, Ivis Siton. He has a recent book called Mythocracy. And he would say that attention economy, which organizes our political perception. So, some of those things that like earlier, very old ways or like conventional ways of reading myths would be about like some kinds of sacred sites or some kinds of things that emanates your worldview, but those sides are completely shifting with under the pressure of the new politics, under the pressure of the spectacles, and there I will say mythicide is emerging. So I see a gap between whatever Ramayana, like many times like conventional scholars interpret and what is unfolding in the streets with the speech act of say Jai Sri Ram. Myth does not remain a matter of interpretation here, but a matter of faith. It is just like faith, effect of the faith that becomes the force, and that is like bringing in the whole things, unfolding the things. So let me start with a small story. Tomorrow is Diwali. In my place in Bihar and parts of Jharkhand, we used to call it Sohrai. Sohrai was the term that I grew up like hardly nowadays they call Diwali and Sohrai together, but earlier they will show Sohrai was more prominent like festival. In my childhood it was more an agricultural festival. Sohrai still remains a major agricultural festival in Jharkhand, but Bihar, where you have more dominant kinds of Hindutva discourse coming in, the Sohrai is more getting oriented towards Ramayana and Vedic kinds of tradition. In Jharkhand, with the different kinds of indigeneity discourse, they are able to move in a different way. Then it changed to Lakshmi Puja. When I only came to Delhi, then I came to know that you organize Diwali because Rama, that day Rama came, like, after winning, only after coming to Delhi, I came to know about this story. But now this story became prominent in my parts of Bihar also, and completely able to completely remove those. So now with the coming of the new festivals, you have coming of the new sweets, new kinds of rituals, new kinds of decoration, new kinds of spectacles and songs. And because still, at least in terms of Sorai, when I think about, then you had a lot of ecological connections with the locality. You had lot of some kinds of grains were important. So at least you need to have like puffed kinds of like things, about 5 grains, all are getting displaced. So what I'm trying to say that how this is the one example of mythicide, that how coming of one powerful myth is able to completely annihilate the local cultural practices that was more perhaps connected with the local ecology, perhaps was giving some kinds of more organic kinds of information sharing with the community, that is getting completely like either displaced, or one can say like at the level of become, it is changing so fast many times, and it is inheriting too much that it becomes like that, as you are not able to recognize your own landscape. Because we cannot think in terms of, because any festival comes with a lot of memory, with their location, with their ecology. What does loss of festival means? What happens when Sorai becomes Ram Navami, like some kinds of other festival? Then we are losing some different kinds of, and this all happens through myth. Same way earlier, if I remember, then Either you are participating in some kinds of ritual or some kinds of action oriented practices. Your mother is asking you to lead 5 years, you are just going to lead 5 years. They are asking you to do some kinds of things, and you are doing without asking that what does it mean. You're not necessarily asking for the meaning. It was like some kind of very embodied action oriented practices that you are participating, and you are learning with the ages, with the time, and whether many times you understand the interpretation, many times you are not understanding the interpretation, but still you are participating with some kinds of rationalization. What is happening that all the action have to have some kinds of interpretations. Now without interpretation you cannot have a festival. So just whenever I type about some festival now, I find different you have priest, all the priest, they are sitting on YouTube and they are telling you that why you celebrate this festival. And that is becoming, people are watching YouTube, people are watching mobile phones, and they are getting oriented towards those things. So whether earlier, same way, we can talk about school, our school kinds of syllabus. So earlier, even you, of course, that you are a greater storyteller. So even if you think about some kinds of a storytelling, nobody would ask you that what you have learned from us, story. As a part of some kinds of a storytelling, that was not part that, okay, what was the moral, a story behind this kinds of a story that you were listening. But now either you are going to a school or either you are doing some kinds of action that become very inherent, inherent structure that you have to have some kinds of interpretation, comprehension, in which you are participating in. And with this force of myth, all the local festivals, agricultural festivals that I can think about, at least in North India. So one can say that in North India now we don't have any festival where Muslim can participate, or any other can participate, any other religious minorities can participate, because all necessarily have to have some kinds of Vedic interpretation, Ramayana interpretation, on those interpretation. Otherwise your festival is not festival at all, and otherwise you cannot celebrate festival. Yeah, so that is becoming the kinds of crisis. I think few years back the crisis came in, I think Singapore, no, Malaysia, where they were you have some Muslim community people, they were celebrating Pongal, and then the Minister of Education there asked that, but again this is a Hindu festival, and they registered, they said no, but this is my Tamil festival. But back home in Tamil festival you can see that Pongal is almost becoming Hindu festival. And that is the crisis I'm talking about, that you don't have a space where common sharing is happening, and how myth is becoming the major benchmark where myth is able to. So two ways we can think about this crisis. One, that in way neoliberal capitalism or neoliberal kinds of crisis, we are lacking the narrative or power of that kinds of narrative, or seeing in a complex ways. So that narrative is getting completely eroded. It is becoming just coming out as an effect. Second, that you have a powerful myth is able to completely take out the whole landscape. It is able to completely change your geography, where you are not able to make some kinds of more connection with your ecology, with the kinds of community and things like that. And it is already, so there are some kinds of a structure. And then my question again comes there, why Ramayana only? Again you have in Bihar, I can say still, despite of all this hangama around Ramayana, I can still say it is not a popular festival. It is not a popular kinds of things. And therefore whenever I read a scholar say that this is our text, I don't see this is our text, because I could never associate it with that text. Earlier, first I could see some television channels, some series that is happening, and then I could make some sense of Ramayana. Otherwise go to communities after communities, they are not really aware about Ramayana. So there have been whole some kinds of I will say lot of emphasis around Ramayana, and that text was for me never that powerful the way a scholars was reading it. So this was the first part where I will say it is creating some kinds of myths. So Chhat was again a kind of very agricultural harvest festival. Now earlier they were trying to bring some different kinds of character around Chhat. Now Chhat, because again people are trying to associate in new interpretation, people are trying to associate Chhat with Ramayana, or that kinds of the figure of Rama. So I'm saying that how one, two powerful myths are able to capture the whole geography. And then once you have that geography, once you have the infrastructure, Ramayana is almost working as an infrastructure. Once it becomes an infrastructure, it is quite easy to organize Hindutva kinds of forces. It is quite easy to organize some kinds of myth, and that becomes really easier in every way around. So my second problem is very much associated with archetypal problem. So is there something inherently problematic with Ramayana text? One, that I told you that what is how it is unfolding in contemporary time. Second, is it some structure that how out of hundred thousands of things Ramayana is becoming important and going quite easy with the national kinds of national ideology. So whether we are thinking in terms of very Nehruvian ideology, in a very that kinds of ideology or contemporary ideology, it is fitting and providing something. And you have find that many epos, if you reading Ramayana closely, and again I'm not talking about all interpretation of Ramayana, at least the more popular interpretation of Ramayana, Valmiki Ramayana and some other Ramayana that is more popular in North India, then you will find that most of the things in Ramayana is happening outside, as you are watching Mickey Mouse. So Mickey Mouse will always go to Arab land and so some kinds of encounter with the others, and that becomes very archetypal kinds of things that I find that you don't find in Mahabharata but you find in Ramayana. Very archetypal structures where you have lot of engagement with others. You already have you were giving interesting examples about Sita and those songs and things. But again, largely for thinking about the popular kinds of narrative, then it is more about you are engaging with Sri Lanka, you are engaging with the enemy country, you are engaging with the Banar Sena, you are engaging with the rishis. So you have most of the archetypal structure itself does something with the othering. It is a dialogue with the other. One can read that dialogue in a very positive ways. So even if you are thinking about caste, that what has been Rama's engagement with the different caste, then Ramayana already recognize that they are others. Somewhere they recognize they're not family, they're others, and then you are engaging with them. And therefore, othering becomes quite possible a structure in this interpretation. And perhaps I will say that at a very archetypal level, Ramayana provides us something where the ideology of otherings are entering into. So this was second problem that I was thinking about. And then if you're thinking about with the kinds of Hindutva rhetoric and Greater India rhetoric, I think Ramayana becomes a very almost ideology umpire. If you are aspiring to make India bigger empire, then Ramayana provides you almost like a Milton's Paradise kinds of text. That okay, that is the text that the way Sikandar he came with the epic and the sword together. Same way we can think about our own ruler, our own leaders are going with the epic and sword or epic and weapon together. And that is again some kinds of very that can go with the archetypal but also can go with the interpretation that very much becoming popular kinds of interpretation in Ramayana kinds of take. Other my problem comes with the very Susan Sontag interpretation against. So is there possibility to go against the interpretation? She has this wonderful text where she's talking about against interpretation, because one that in a very beginning I have tried to summarize that perhaps we cannot read the contemporary crisis through the interpretation, even if you have hundred of interpretation, because it is things are not happening and unfolding through the interpretation. They are happening through different other kinds of registers, and that becomes the crux. So I think here either you are thinking about more formalistic interpretation or content-based interpretations. I think the text that Ramayana kinds of it has become almost cultural phenomena. That is, myth is just one part of it, interpretation is just one part of it. So I think perhaps we also need to think about some kinds of against interpretation kinds of paradigm to think about this text and engagement. My final point is that why do the anti-caste intellectuals remain apprehensive about the figure of Rama and the stories of Ramayana from long time back? Now you can very early, very early time, and they almost they. It is not that you have many. Either you are thinking about Periyar, you are thinking about Ram Sarup Verma from Hindi literature, and also figure from Punjab who wrote this Adi Ramayana basically. Sorry, I'm forgetting his name. But again, the whole point is that they had a very in beginning very serious engagement with Ramayana. They tried to read, they tried to interpret, but after a point of time they realized that something that they were looking for, something they were aspiring for was not getting provided, or something that, and that becomes a major kinds of no. So do they have a similar attitude? But they do not have similar attitudes with other kinds of myth. So for example, you have Phule, Jyotiba Phule, who is becoming very, very critical of Ramayana, but he's not so critical about Bali Raja, the kingdom of Bali Raja. Same way, Periyar is like almost giving us some kinds of Dravidian kinds of thinking about Dravidian kinds of aspiration. You have many if you're thinking about Ravidas, then he will talk about Begum. But again, why they were not engaging with Ramayana? Why they were not so interested in Rama? One can take that okay, Kabir was still talking about Ram or some kinds of naming of the Ram, but again that is very different, very very different. Even if you're thinking through some kinds, because it was not an engagement with myth, it was engagement with some kinds of metaphor, it was an engagement with some kinds of naming of the world. So I still read Kabir in a very different way. And then can we say that they were really futuristic in their claims with the figure and epic? They have already read the science of the myth, because myth is also about sign, what sign you are reading about the myth, because what whether you are able to claim it or not claim it. Like many times there is a whole idea that Gonds also have Ramayana, these Adivasi also have Ramayana. But again, who are the figures who are appearing in Ramayana? Almost they become many times subservient. They are becoming wife, they are becoming some brother, other brothers. But again, centrality of figure is working in a very different way. And I think these are the some of those could have been readings about of anti-caste intellectuals to be very very apprehensive about Ramayana. And that also gives us like a whole range of the things that from north to south, anti-caste intellectuals are very united when it comes to at least the engagement with the text of Ramayana or Ramayana kinds of myth and interpretations. And finally, I will say I will also read it as a counter revolution. In very contemporary time, Ramayana is more about counter revolution. And so see, during the COVID time, you suddenly have government decided to broadcast Ramayana epic. And then how you read these kinds of things, that how so why in the time of crisis where there was some kinds of possibility of politics, then government is suddenly bringing counter these kinds of Ramayana texts, Ramayana kinds of episodes. Same way one can think about several other, same way one can think about demolition of Babri Mosque and coming of the Rama. So there are different history or events that unfolded in our contemporary time, and that really gives me a lot of those kinds of influxes or some kinds of hints to read Ramayana or these kinds of myth as some kinds of force of counter narrative or force of counter revolution for that matter. So I sorry I've taken a lot of time, but thank you so much. And really, of course, we have a lot of dialogue, we lot of concerns that is very much going together. So it's more similarities than differences that we can talk about. Yeah, you are silent, Ram. Yeah, okay.
So, thanks, Brahm, for that. I just have a few things which I would like to pose to both of your talks. One of the things I'm thinking about is clearly there are two levels to reading cultural texts in the broadest sense. One is to adopt the old semiotics distinction. One is a authorly text or a writerly text, and the other is a readerly text, right? The same text through the perspective of the intentions of the author or authors, and then the perspective of how audience read the text, and those need not necessarily correspond, right? So even if we can say that texts like Ramayana or Mahabharata are polysemic, and there are multiple possible interpretations, um, possible by readers, it is very clear that there is one version of it or one narrative of it that is being amplified. So there comes the question of the political economy of myth, that amongst many possible variations, there is the systematic promotion of one set of narratives, or to center one set of actors as protagonists and others become reduced to extras, so to speak, right? Um, so, even if it has traveled across different contexts, whether it's Southeast Asia, even there are versions of Ramayana in Islam. I believe this caravan has done a whole thing about
Yeah.
this all this stuff. But nonetheless, the centrality of this, what you were saying, that a certain set of actors remain the protagonists, that seems to me a question of political economy rather than the text. So, what would you say to that kind of
Mm-hmm.
question? The other is, I'm wondering, you know, are myths, some myths or some texts naturally lend themselves to national imagination. They are macro stories. And as cultural politics, or those who are interested in cultural politics, do national stories or bigger stories inherently lend themselves to kind of distortions or towards in the service of oppression and so on? And do micro stories or local, what has been called the little goddess movement, are they inherently kind of progressive? And should cultural politics try to kind of revive the million little goddesses rather than the macro story? Um, so that's another kind of strategic question, I suppose. Um, and I guess, yeah, actually, I'd like to hear two, and then maybe we can have another round. And Arshia, you want to go?
Yeah, I want to address this. We're talking about narratives, right? You are suggesting that there are readerly narratives and there are writerly narratives. You are also suggesting the same thing, right?
Yes.
What I'm completely unable to understand is what is so persuasive about the Hindutva narrative, because these are multiple stories that are in the air simultaneously. All of us are hearing all of these stories. Why are so many of us persuaded by the one that is the most exclusionary? Yeah, why do we follow the narrative that excludes so many people? Rather than, I'm also telling you a Ramayana story, I'm telling you in a very beautiful way. I'm trying to make place for everybody in my own head, as well as, why I'm a very good storyteller. Why is nobody listening to me? And so I think that I was thinking about that all through your talk, this idea that after independence, Ramayana becomes a text of choice, right?
Yeah.
Which very much with the macro story and a particular kind of nationalism, and that epics, which genre-wise in terms of world literature, Ramayana and Mahabharata are both epics, and epics are about us versus them. Hum kaun hai aur wo kaun hai? Who is the insider, who is the outsider? And this is one of the most horrible phrases I've ever heard in my life, but nothing sums it up better than that BJP guy from UP who said, Hum hai Ramzade, ye hum haramzade. Yeah, now, the brilliant,
Yeah.
for the education, for the cultural, invocation. But that is what it is. Okay? This is how micro stories become the basis of separation, and that is the oldest way to think about epics. Go away. Yeah, sorry for that. But problem is, why is the story that I am telling not persuasive enough? Yeah, to this. I don't like to say this, but I think it unfortunately bears mentioning how male this Hindutva world is. Right? So they're not interested in hearing a story from a little old lady. Right? They would much rather hear from their masculinized, militarized brotherhood. Shadi ka zamana gaya. Nobody is interested in listening to stories anymore at these, at bedtime with their grandparents, with their grandmothers. That's what has made this possible. A very, very masculinized universe. And so whatever was feminine in the Ramayana has been suppressed and the masculine part has risen. Therefore, we have angry Hanuman.
Yeah, so Ram, I was thinking about some of your questions. So one that definitely, at least in my kinds of reading, I feel like there is some kinds of very political economy of Ramayana, and that go with some kinds of idea of the state, because Ram also comes with this idea of the kingdom, some kinds of kingdom, imagination of that kingdom and things. So I think that political economy very much informs some kinds of politics and political economy in which actors are playing, and at least some of those stories that I'm aware of, like of course there are stories that like it comes with more kinds of feminist viewpoint and those viewpoints, but those stories are not the evocations. So what are getting evoked in a very like popular kinds of politics, and if you're thinking through those lens, then I think very selectively many times more I will say that political economy of those structures or political economy of those actors remain very much clear for me. And I think you are using very like a Marxist term, political economy, but again I think that can be the solid term to think about that what is the political economy in which Ramayana is becoming the fascinating text to that level. I will say that in fascism, almost it is reading some kinds of the way at least those stories are getting circulated, evoked with the whole new kinds of a spectacle. Either you are thinking about a statue, formation of a statue, there's whole spectacles, and that is where I think at least I would say that the way I can think about. um, I've been working on this whole idea of that how what is the kinds of contemporary evocation of the politics, and they say so you are telling the story, but the point is that you are not able to create the spectacle. You are creating the stories, but you are not able to create constantly. You have mediatized version, different other kinds of things are informing you. Media landscape has completely changed, and I think in that way that instantly I think more than hearing the story, the slogan so Haramjade and Ramjade makes more effect, and that is the way stories are getting circulated, and that's the way perhaps this whole spectacles are getting created. I am not sure if local religion or local kinds of deities are the answer to these kinds of very nationalistic imagination always. Many times they also inform each other. So either you are thinking about many, because see, either you are thinking about local and nationals are largely if you're thinking about local is not a one category. Local is very fragmented. And therefore which deities you're talking about, which what are their place, not necessarily local or regional. I will always read as some kinds of counter to national, because a lot of regional kinds of formation that is directly informing to national kinds of construction, and therefore I would be more apprehensive about that. Local deities are necessarily providing you some kinds of answer to national. Maybe it can provide you some kinds of counter kinds of argument, but also it is about how they are getting appropriated when they become national, whether they. So what happens when liminal becomes the norm? What when this is the kinds of dialogue we can ask. What happens when these liminal deities are becoming the part of the mainstream deities? I don't think they are then going to behave in the same way. Their behavior will also change. The whole attitudes will change, and I think therefore not necessarily. But yes, for a counter to think about some kinds of alternative, I think that some of those alternative narratives and spaces remain more, I will say, prominent in that way. And therefore, instead of finding some kinds of alternative within Ramayana, I would like to see outside of Ramayana, and therefore outside of more kinds of outside critique of Ramayana in that way. Because for me, that is the point I was trying to make, that it is really exaggerated text for me, really exaggerated kinds of cultural performances for me. Still in my they in Bihar and other parts of North India, I will say that local festival mobilize more people. Local festival, even orchestra performance can mobilize more people than say Ramayana. But yes, in terms of more mediatized reading and that kinds of political readings, that is becoming the text where people are getting mobilized, and not necessarily through the myth and interpretation or complex ways of reading the things, but because also we are living in a time where attention is becoming the crisis. So how those spectacle, those kinds of affect are able to mobilize people in a longer sense, not necessarily they are really engaging with the text, and that is the where it is coming to that kinds of crisis. So I don't know whether I have answered your questions, but again, that is my kind of understanding about this. Also,
Brahma,
one point is sorry, one more point. Sorry, I will just one that whole idea of reading earlier. Now that Ram is getting more militarized, he's becoming more masculine in that way. But I have a problem with the very liberal readings of that Ramayana also. When think about Hanuman is standing in a very subservient way, almost like a slave, because one of the interpretations, recently, Ajay, in JNU as a faculty, we have been asked to do a workshop. And what was happening in workshop, that whole app, you had an app system where you have to enter, and in the app Hanuman a strategy where so you have to work through the Hanuman strategy. What was this Hanuman strategy? That we were told that even despite of burning his tail, Hanuman was able to burn Sri Lanka. So you have to adopt some kinds of a strategy that should be like that. What I'm trying to say that what exactly the government is doing now, or maybe I think this strategy also goes with the corporate. So it is not just about about government or non-government organization. It is also about corporate, but again producing some kinds of servient labor where one can be, despite of all kinds of hindrances, one is going to make some kinds of success. And therefore we have one of my colleagues, Soumyabrat Chaudhary. He will use the term sudrafication of global economy. So almost there is an attempt to bring sudras, and Hanuman becomes the figure. So suppose how you are reading, like within that kinds of not militaristic, very human kinds of that, and figurations of Ramayana, before Ramayana, how I will read Hanuman, who is completely that kinds of figure, and what was the location of Hanuman, even if you're going through some kinds of interpretations. And then I think Ramayana is looking for those kinds of figures where subservient can be produced, that kinds of labor can be produced. So I think that also becomes one of my kinds of interest in which I'm trying to delve into. Yeah, sorry, you wanted to say something.
Wanted to go back to the macro story, and that is it the time do we try to um, reinvigorate little goddess cultures? Do we go back to Desha and Saruta and all of that? But it's the beauty of all the Mahapuranas, right? And I mean, in that you can include Ramayana and Mahabharata, right? It's about everybody, everything, it was all happening here. But every single one of these stories has a Sthala Purana version. Yeah. If you go to any village, anywhere in India, they will say, see that little stream, when the Rama and Sita were traveling through here, Sita was very tired, and so she sat down under this tree, and then Hanuman released an arrow, and the water, Lakshmana released an arrow, and the water came out of the earth, and Sita was able to drink and refresh herself. And if it's north of Kishkinda, then it'll be Rama was very tired, and Lakshmana did this. But this is where they sat. This is her footprint, Lepakshi, right outside Bangalore, right? This is where Ravana carried her away. The footprint is this big. Yeah, I mean, but that's not the point. Everybody believes Ramayana happened in my backyard, right? So the local tradition is so important. And as we leave the land, as we get more and more alienated from our native places, yeah, these are very powerful words. Native place. There is desh, there is ghar, there is vatan. These are all words of belonging, and different degrees of belonging. So as we get more and more migration into the cities, people are susceptible to national myths because they don't know the local myth anymore. You can't say Sita Maiya ye hua. Kishkinda Hampi. Every rock in Hampi is associated with the Rama story. Vali died here. This is where the Matanga Rishi lived. This is where they fought. These are the 7 sala trees. This is where, Sita wasn't even carried away. It doesn't matter. This is where her jewels fell, right? And to live in a sacred geography is to be located very, very powerfully. And when you are dislocated from a sacred geography, then you're susceptible to you need something else to create identity, belonging, all of that. It has to be national because there is nothing holding you anymore. So
can I just add one more thing? Yeah, I would like to add one more point because, yeah, so quite agree with that. Also, but again, Arshia, I was just thinking in terms of some of those cultural policies, this whole Asthal Purana and how it got circulated. So, for example, I know at least one documentation by IGNCA where there was a whole project about finding footprints of Mahabharata. So that whole project was done by IGNCA, where there was a whole attempt to find some kinds of footprints of Mahabharata. So go to villages and try to find whatever gives you, either it is birds or it's maybe horses foot. You are trying to make some kinds of association with Mahabharata, and this happens a lot in if you go to Uttarakhand, and Uttarakhand especially massively. It happened at a massive level where you have more indigenous population, but now landscape is getting organized around Asthal Purana and getting interpreted around, and that also leads to some kinds of very that imposed kinds of a structure in which, and many times also it's not happening just from out above side where people are trying to impose, but also to get legitimacy to make some kinds of association. Many times also the lower caste, the other people are also trying to make. But otherwise, you also had a very different kinds of version of like landscape, those sacred geography, those landscape, those myth kinds of narrative. So my fear is also that what happens when that geography becomes part of some kinds of Ramayana landscape. Like when once it becomes part of it, then you try to see everything in the same ways, then your views already get singularized because other interpretations. So my problem is not just about like how Hindutva is colonizing Hinduism. My problem is that also Hinduism with some kinds of larger mainstream myths have already colonized that kinds of things, and then that makes very easier for Hindutva to enter into that because you already have those resources, cultural resources, those like figures. Now you can just walk in and can like mobilize that. Okay, this is Sita story. So now you have Janki, like Mithila Anchal, where like now the government is constructing new temple. After Ayodhya, they are constructing new temple in Maithili region. And this, we think about that whole story of Sita, who sings this story. And largely in Maithili region, these stories have been popular among Brahmin caste. But again, how this Brahminical vision has been completely constructed, the whole new concepts of sacred geography, and then now getting imposed on the whole landscape with the construction of new temple and construction of the new statue. So I am also trying to understand those layers about the circulation of Asya. Yeah.
I completely agree with you. Government-funded agency, a national
Yeah.
cultural organization, it is diabolical when they go out with this project. Okay, oh, you never thought about this. Where do you think Sita would have? That is pernicious, that is diabolical, right? But when there is something sweet and organic and indigenous about this kind of location, I think it's very important, right? But it's happening. The shrines, you should see what has happened to Anjanadri, where Hanuman is supposed to have been born. Right? It's be a beautiful, small little temple where you could go to watch the sunset, right? Now there are ghantis, there are like the steps have been constructed. People are thinking of it as people are going to pilgrimage. Tukaram's place in Dehu. My God, when I used to go there like 10 years ago, you would find Barricades, one Barricade, two Barricades, just sitting in this old little bit and singing Tuka songs. Got marble floors and it's got
Yeah.
huge big and the whole it's organized towards a very aggressive ownership. Yeah, no, yeah, take your point about everything is a double-edged sword, yeah, Brahm.
Yeah. No, of course, yeah, yeah, of course.
Really. Sorry.
I have many more questions about, how whether the openness quotient of any myth, and whether that's a factor in lending itself to appropriation. Um, and the more grounded it becomes, the less open it is to reappropriation, manipulation, etc. And also questions about affect and what drives affect in a myth. Uh, but I think we should like open this up, and if there's anyone who's been listening who have questions on YouTube or questions who have come to see in person, then we should like give some time. Otherwise, there are no questions that I can like we can close with a few words. Yeah, they will comment on YouTube. But yeah, if you have any questions or reactions, anyone?
I had a lot while the talk was going on and how I said
Can't. Yeah. Can't
Yes.
hear Ram. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll repeat the questions from the audience sitting here in Bangalore. Anyone?
I have one. Okay, so I mean, you started talking about how Ganpati was celebrated in Maharashtra or Durga Puja was celebrated in West Bengal. So I come from Lucknow, UP of course. So a lot of these kind of festivals were just holidays for us in
Yes.
school. There were no school assemblies that were happening. People weren't celebrating it uh, locally in the city as much. I mean, there might be some communities who were from Bengal would come and they would have a small celebration. But now there are full markets of Punjab and like Ganpati is now a thing where the roads are blocked, jammed throughout the day, and they're doing the resurgam in the Gumti, and all of that is happening. And also this sudden rise in Ram Navami, and these like earlier I used to see these posters of Ram with and Lakshman, a very sleek, neat Ram, beautiful, and now this bodybuilder, Trishul, and also the slogans and the Hindutva pop being played. But now I think of it, I also feel that social media has some role to play in this. So this one nation, one Hindu, everybody will celebrate the festival the same way, will also dress the same way, and will play the same songs. I think it's also been, yeah, eat the same kind of food. I think it's also coming from where everybody has access to social media and influential people obviously post it and then propagate, and then everybody wants to just replicate it and then post it online or make reels out of it, and everybody's following it. I mean, children, very small children are now making reels on Mere Bharat Ka Bachcha Bachcha, and they will do it, and it's a performance on festivals, and it is also accepted in a way online. So what do you think is the impact of the digital consumption of media?
But this is my problem. Why are we listening to them when there are alternative narratives, right? I mean, Muslims can be posting, or like not as Muslims, just as not in a hostile way, not in a don't do this kind of way. But you know what? There's another story, right? I mean, I have so many Hindu friends who are now embarrassed to say that they're Hindu, right? It's like, yeah, I can't say this. And it's like, why? Until you say it, until your voice is also heard, unless you say, I could be a Hindu without doing all of these things, right? This is not going to change. We all have equal access to social media, right? Some of us are just using it more and better than others are. But my problem is still, even if we're all using it equally, why is the story being listened to and believed? Yeah, what has happened to us as society, as a nation, as a world, where we are much more inclined to go for a story of hatred than a story of equanimity. Forget love, compassion. Those are very, very specific to particular religions, compassion and love and mercy, and, very much. But not even to just say, it's okay, man, just you do you and I'll do me. That is also not being heard. That's the problem, and we observe that this is true, but we're not asking the question of what has happened or why has it happened. Sorry.
Brahm, you got a question, no?
Yeah, so I could not see who is the person, but yeah, who is asking? Yeah.
This is Fiza from.
Acha, Fiza. Okay, yeah, Fiza. Okay. So yeah, thank you, Fiza. But again, I have a slightly different take, because one idea about historians reading Ramayana and things was that we had 300 interpretations, we had so many interpretations, and if you read and I have collected a speeches of Prime Minister Modi, where he's almost talking about almost 100 interpretation of Ramayana in the same language. So he's not saying that, okay, I'm going to impose one kind of Ramayana or one kind of festival. He, at least the way he's saying that Sikhism also had Ramayana, in Tamil Nadu we also had Ramayana, this also had Ramayana, and this is the language he's talking about. So of course, we cannot say that it means he's almost talking like a way A.K. Ramanujan used to talk about. No, not necessarily. Intention is completely different. When A.K. Ramanujan was making argument, then he was making an argument precisely about different kinds of diversity, claims of diversity, pluralism, and everything. But here I think the inherent idea is, now don't go with this logic about Hindutva just trying to impose one culture, one race, one kinds of festival. They are okay. You can do different. You have Ganesh Utsav in maybe in Maharashtra. You can have Jagannath kinds of festival in Odisha. But again, they all have to come with the hatred, same amount of hatred or hatred against a community, and that is becoming a very common kinds of platform where things are coming together. One can organize, but it has to come at the level of a spectacle. It has come at the level of hate, and that is getting oriented towards So perhaps in my reading, it is not about different interpretation can have a different interpretation, but again, it should be in the bracket. In that bracket, if you are able to bring at that level, if you are able to bring to that point where there is some amount of hatred or there is some amount of mobilization, I think they are okay with that. So that would be one thing. And so one, that you are right, that one way of it is also about fashioning your festival. So we are living in the age of identity crisis and things where everyone is looking for or trying to fashion their own identity. So either you are thinking about fashioning of Hindu identity through very Ram Navami kinds of festival, where young generations are coming from across the caste communities, and they're trying to fashion themselves with the very that kinds of violence, the call of, I will not say even violence, but again some kinds of very franchised kinds of trans mode in which they all are participating. But inherent idea is also some kinds of hatred, but some kinds of mobilization. So I think earlier, if you're thinking about 70s, then this whole idea of Valmiki Ramayana, one idea of Ram was there. But I think they are also shifting their politics, and I think in contemporary kinds of political scenario, I see that they are not they are quite okay with that. You are coming with different festivals, come, but again, you have to come to this level. You have to come with this kinds of condition. If you are able to follow that condition, then you are part of my my family.
I think the last time we had this kind of counter mobilization, what Brahm is talking about, that it is a question of spectacle and mobilization. If it's going to be attractive at all, if it's going to be a challenge, was CA. That was the last time there was, for me at least, a real counter narrative was the.
Also, also adding to questions that you are asking, I think it needs more exploration perhaps, and we all can explore about that, what could be the reasons that people are finding that those stories interesting. Because also we are living in a time where isolation, different kinds of crises are together, where people are looking for some kinds of association. So neither you are with your family, neither you are in the kinds of that kinds of collective. So those collectives, those spaces have completely failed, and therefore this becomes a place where people are getting the sense of participatory that come, and that bodily participation, which are the other places. So I will give my example of my own village, my own community family. I was writing about that. To give that example, so my cousin brothers who are quite elder to me, they used to participate in Muharram. They will go with their swords, lathi sticks, and they will participate in Muharram, that doing that all kinds of acrobats, dance and things, almost going at the level of trance, one can say. But now their generations are participating in Ram Navami. I am saying that they are just looking for a spaces of participation, because perhaps alternative cultures are not able to give that a space, and therefore also that crisis is happening slightly many times.
Yeah.
I had two questions. I had two questions. I don't know who's. There's a lot to think over, so
Really?
try and frame it in a coherent way. One is that you had mentioned that a lot of your work is around being a textualist, and I was just curious about how, as a textualist, how do you kind of arrive at what appears open or closed within a text? I guess I was trying to think about where you rest your faith in the act of retelling, and if that's something to, because of course we've spoken about it at the level of ideology and politics, and the fact that resistance itself is a uneven terrain. What you were saying, that even if I'm offering an alternative narrative, it's naturally not going to be heard as loudly or as convincingly as a lot of other narratives. But I'm wondering, just in your practice of study and of work, what is it that to you allows a certain story or a certain text to be, particularly when it's such a dominant text in all the ways that you've spoken about, where do you still rest your faith in retelling, particularly in this current political time? And my question to Brahm was that, not a question so much, but you were suggesting that, of course, that there is no space for interpretation at all within the, I guess, the physique of these epics, because they are at the heart of it rigid and cannot kind of be opened up to any other kind of values. And you were also kind of responding to Ram, saying that local goddesses, local myths might not be the answer, might not be a counter resistance. So where would you place kind of anti-caste efforts in this field? How would you look at what either either a revival or a re-excavation, or would you look at it just as adding to themselves? Where would you kind of place your energies?
So Angarika, if I'm listening correctly, then Angarika, I got your second question. First, I missed a bit part of it, like no, when you are talking about paraphysic or physicality, then what is your questions that you are asking? First one.
I think Brahm, first one was like more aimed at Arshia actually, where the question was like in any text, how do you um, locate the hope or the possibility of a retelling or a reinterpretation, reclamation, and so on. So where does the optimism come from, and how do you like locate it in a text? Are there some criteria and so on? That was the question, Angarika's for Arshia actually. But if you also have an answer for that, welcome to answer. Yeah, you go first.
So, for me personally, I mean, like so many other people in India, I first heard Ramayana when I was a child. Yeah. So for me, it was never an alien story or a story that I had to enter or anything like that. And you know, I was born in 1960, so I grew up at a time when Ramayana was everywhere, but in a very non-threatening way. It was just everywhere. Everybody knew. You would hear people say, "Oh, so nice, it's like Rama, that fellow is," or whatever it is. Adresh is a real Kaikai, or it was just common. And then when I went back to it as a student, it was Hanuman. That was like, what is this? No story have I heard, and I read a lot. I've always been reading. I have never encountered a character as charismatic as Hanuman. Right? And even when you're a Sanskrit student and you're studying Rama, this is what you want to do. You want to be able to speak Sanskrit and fly. These are the two things you want, and he has them. That's ever, I mean, whatever part of me needed to respond to the text, Hanuman was the person that I was responding to, right? So I came to it very much from there. And I mean, I have more Hanuman, Kripa stories than most bhaktas, I can tell you that. I mean, Hanuman has appeared in my life and done magic things and all like that, right? It's really true. Even though I'm a person who doesn't believe, right? I believe in magic, but I'm not sure I believe in the magic of the gods. So there was that. And then, then after, this was all through my 20s. And then, after I'd finished translating Ramayana, I was well into my 30s by then. And then what struck me was Sita. Yeah, I was already calling myself a feminist and everything, and behaving in very feminist ways, the way feminists behave and think, but still now it is like, who is this woman and how is she resisting? Right? So for me, it is becoming more and more a text of resistance rather than a text of oppression. And I think that is, if you read anything seriously, right? You could be reading Crime and Punishment. You could be reading Tale of Genji. You could be reading an African story. Right? If you read it with your full heart and mind, it is going to reveal itself to you. It is going to give you the space to enter it. Right? So again, whatever we do, it is a generosity of the text. Right? 40 years now it's been for me and Ramayana, and I'm still not done. I'm still writing about Ramayana. Right? So I think, but I want to say, Brahma, it's not about interpreting the text. It's actually about reading it, because if you read it like fully, all the subversion you want, all the resistance you want, all the alternative narratives that we're seeking are in Valmiki Ramayana, right? It's just that we don't read it for ourselves. We let somebody else tell us what's in it, right? whether it's our grandmothers or it's somebody even like myself, because I did a translation. So, or it's there are so many people who are willing to tell you what you should think. Think for yourself, do the work, read the book, you know. Um, that is not happening, Brahma. And I think that is also why we are susceptible to quick explanations, easy explanations that empower us, not by making us good, but by making other people bad. Nobody wants to think anymore. No, everybody wants to live in binaries. Boring. So yeah. So in that sense, I mean, I'm embarrassed at how much of a textualist I am. You know, um, practice for me is the harder part. Ritual and practice to participate um, in the reality of faith. That for me is difficult. But to live in the okay, where do I place my faith? I place my faith in the imagination, in the literary imagination, because that is truly liberating. And it is deeply, deeply moving, because in a literary imagination, monkeys can fly and monkeys can speak Sanskrit. Beat that, nothing does. You know, really. Sorry, that was a very academic response, but yeah.
Yeah, Brahm, you want to address the question that Angarika had for you?
Yeah, so Angarika, of course, I think this is a kind of I don't think I have answers to say that how we are trying to perhaps use Arshia term like reimagine or participate in some kinds of reimagination. So one that I quite agree that many times we do make quick decision, and this is also about time we live in, because this is also the crisis we are living in, that maybe it is about reading, it is about engaging, but for me it is also about some kinds of text that is imposing some kinds of worldviews, and at least it is too heavy for me. Ramayana is too heavy for me in that way. So it becomes text that is coming from some of those stories, marvelous stories. I have been working on epic ballads, local ballads, and local ballads. You have ballads of Dina Bhadri, you have ballads of Phulan Devi. New ballads are getting constructed, reimagined around Phulan Devi, and where I find a lot of hopes, where very they are trying to address very contemporary politics, contemporary kinds of configuration, and that gives me a lot of hope in that sense. So it is not like a big narrative that I am interested in. I am more interested in very a micro narrative that maybe just having a so any, and that is why I'm very apprehensive about big epic kinds of text and things. I'm more interested in a smaller text of that is coming from very maybe in a village with a community where they are just thinking about. So you have a stories of Dina Bhadri, and where they find emancipation because they are the caste that is coming from Mahadalit communities in Bihar, and they are telling you stories where they are not able to go to the market. Very small story, they are not able to go to the market, and then a lot of fights insinuates, they participate, they struggle, and one day they are just able to enter the bazaar market, and they celebrates like anything that we are in the bazaar today. So they are not trying to again become king, or not trying to make some kinds of new kinds of declaration. That's a story end up there with a lot of opening that they became king, or they may not become king, or they are ordinary citizen of the city and things. So I'm more interested in opening in that way, where more micro local stories are giving me lots of hope in that way. Same way another chance of, so even if you're thinking about भारत का बच्चा बच्चा जय श्री राम बोलेगा, that is becoming about top hits in that way. Then you also have singers from Maharashtra now, very street singers that way, and then you have they are singing भारत का बच्चा जय जय भीम बोलेगा. So one is coming with a lot of hate, another is coming with some kinds of claim, just I just want to make a claim. I'm not saying that we will have right, or I'm going to become the future king. It is all about just I want to participate, you can also participate, we all should participate, and the culture should become the kinds of sharing things in a very real sense. And I think in terms of sharing, in terms of that kinds of collective imagination, but I'm remain apprehensive about burden of past, burden of big epic, burden of big kinds of a story and things, and that is also my some kinds of so yes. But I don't think that is here.
I also want to sneak in a quick question. Arshia referred to the civic religion at the beginning. So there is one domain of culture and which is kind of firmly located in the religion proper space. I think the constitutional or civic religion space often lacks in affect or fails to mobilize the sacral, emotional kind of network of meanings that often religion proper seems to do almost effortlessly. So, what is the space if it's religion or like constitutionalism? Are those the only two options? Or are there other sites that have the potential to signify and mobilize a particular kind of affect, whether in the service of the right or otherwise? I'm just asking, are there other sites that we can think of? And I'm
I think,
particularly,
yeah, sir.
yeah, because your work is now on this pop stuff and all this thing. So, what is this other space, and how do we look at the contours of this space, and who's governing these other spaces? So anything, any thoughts on that would be interesting, I think. Uh, Brahm, if you want to
Yeah.
go first, Arshia, yeah. Yeah, Brahm, over to
Yeah,
you.
so in fact, like, no, yeah, I will say that, yeah, you're right, quite right. Keep on thinking about more civil kinds of a space or civil kinds of, like, things, then I don't see much hope in terms of the way things are unfolding. And even I have a hope, then I don't think that is able to provide the answer in a street. Like, if you're thinking from more activist point of view, then you find that key either, like, if you want to really counter myth, then history is not the answer. You need to create a new myth, or you need to create a new kinds of, like, no, you necessarily need to enter that kinds of mode. If you, like, there is a music, then you need to have a different kinds of, like, alternative music or counter music for that matter. And therefore, I see a kind, because, like, same way, so this whole secular idea, at least in Indian context, in, like, I work some work in China or Chinese aesthetics, there I can see that aesthetics is becoming almost coming to the, in some zones, aesthetics is almost coming to the parallel with the religion, where aesthetics, there are scholars who will say that, okay, we have the potential to replace aesthetic, like, religion with aesthetics, which comes with some kinds of conviction, and those possibilities are there. But in Indian context, I will say that very secular domains are perhaps lacking in those kinds of spectrum that you have largely pointed out. Either you are thinking about effect, registers, myth, or, like, stories. They're really, really, like, I will say boring in one way, or instrumental in other way. So I don't see much hope there. So necessarily you need to have some kinds of, like, call it a spiritual, call it something else. But I will say it is not religion for me. For me, it is cultural spaces. They are more dynamic, they are more opening, and they cannot be. And the whole problem with the Indian or Indology kinds of readings many times, that either it becomes part of some kinds of folk Hinduism, folk Islam, and things like that. No, culture is much beyond that. It is about, like, shared spaces where we cannot binarize the people, that, okay, you are this or you are that. And I think that still we have a lot of cultural practices where things are still coming together in terms of participation, in terms of doing things together, in terms of eating foods or going to market, and, like, going to local bazaars and things. So I think these are the, I will say that culture is precisely becoming to me more interesting a space than, I will say, necessarily religion in that way, for future politics and for reimagining the spaces itself.
Yeah, yeah. There's one question from a viewer on YouTube. The question, I'll just read it out, even for Arshia's benefit. Question is, how do you define violence in a state that's often redefining their meaning through various means? When is it justified? When is it not? How do we tell the difference? I want to put this question in the context of culture, what we are talking about, not violence in general. Because I think culture, as we have discussed at various times today, culture has played a role in kind of symbolic violence or providing a way for like the enabling of physical violence. So, with respect to symbolic violence, um, what about culture as it is being used today, and any thoughts on um specifically culture or cultural politics that can perhaps prevent violence, or from the lens of violence, what would cultural politics look like? Not necessarily for peace, but just from the lens of violence, how do we look at cultural politics?
Mm.
You know,
So very
I
briefly, this is, yeah, please.
No, I was just the
Please go
first
ahead. Yeah.
that came to mind when these three terms, culture, food, violence, they are actually all being used. What we eat is now the site of such incredible violence, right? And food are also uh, uh, weaponized, right? Like this here, you have to close the shop, you have to do. Of course, it's particular communities and their livelihoods that are suffering the most in this thing. But I think what is really scary to me, I hear you when you say that. It's the small story, right? That it's about the day-to-day thing. Can I go to the bazaar or can I not go to the bazaar? Those are deeply, deeply moving, right? But in these cultural spaces, right, they are the most violent because there are these people that we call cultural vigilantes who are above the law, who operate outside the law, who are themselves weaponized by political parties and vested interests and local elites of all kinds, right? So, and there is no response to that. There's absolutely no response. Somebody comes and says, if you go and watch this movie, I'm going to throw a stone at your head. Who's going to respond? The actor, the director, the producer, the what is it called? Distributor, the owner of the theater. So the response is, Sabko band kar do. Right? In that sense, the cultural sphere is the most vulnerable, and therefore it is the most unprotected. None of us have any recourse to any kind of law when we are culturally attacked. Yeah.
Yeah, so Ram, I was thinking about this whole question of violence because in this, like in the book that I'm doing, that addresses a lot of these questions. Because for me, like many times we have idealized the field of culture that okay, myth is all about like beautiful things, myth is all about glorious past heritage and things, but we have not discussed much of those kinds of violent aspect of myth or violent aspect of those like kinds of what it does to community. And especially I'm more interested in like conducting some kinds of like bringing like way it is unfolding in Palestine, different parts of Palestine, that now you are capturing the things but you're also naming the places. Just act of naming can bring a lot of those things. And same, so I think we need to equally talk about violence that comes through music, because one way of thinking that okay, music is very beautiful art object and things like that. Other way of thinking about the very like origin of music, because inherently it is a sacrificial kinds of like practice. All the music have some kinds of origin, so it is already have some kinds of a structure in ritual where like it carries that kinds of violence. Now what is one way of saying that okay, Hindutva has done something violent with music? I would say other way of saying is that like so one way of saying is that Hindutva is reinterpreting or maybe appropriating music in a very violent way, and that has been a very general notion of thinking about that. My take would be that how music is providing, or violent sides of music is providing more new spheres or opening for Hindutva. So Hindutva is able to enter where they could have never entered. It is entering at the level of senses, it is entering at the level of the body, and that is happening through music. Music already had that violent kinds of connotation, violent kinds of history that we have not addressed. And how can we talk about like music, ritual, and things without violence? This is inherently about sacrifice, all about those kinds of making of those things. So I think inherently we need to talk about those violent sides, expose those aspect of the violent side that looks quite nice in a very idealized kinds of thinking about music, art, aesthetics, and things like that. And that also brings this whole idea about like Sarad Patil. I will say one of the writer I really follow, Sarad Patil, addresses some of those questions. That, for example, if you're thinking about aesthetics, if you're thinking about culture, so earlier there was a whole idea that only few class of people can participate in culture because they have the leisure time. And he completely subverts this idea that okay, how can you talk about, then are you talking about some slave society of Greek society where like there was a clear division about like so slave do not have that kinds of like leisure time, and therefore they cannot produce culture. So I think in terms of also both in terms of definition and also the approaches we have adopted, so I see that phenomena of Hindutva or this whole violent eruption I could see in ritual spaces that is still there. Drum sound, like many of those rituals, drum sound is very, very like haunting in that way. Haunting can come with healing also, but haunting can also perpetuate a lot of violence, how it is getting projected against each other, how it is getting assimilated in that way. So I think one, that we can talk about violence in a very new ways, but other way of thinking about exposing some of those materials that has got very beautified image. So theyyam, either you are thinking about theyyam, either you are thinking about different ritual practices, like it inherently carries a lot of violence in terms of like sacrifice, in terms of different other kinds of attitudes. So I think if you're thinking about contemporary formation of Hindutva, then I think they are able to mobilize the very primordial, or one can say primal, that primal force of those ritual, the primal force of that music, the primal force of that kinds of corporeal kinds of movement. And I think inherently politics is going into that kinds of domain. It's becoming very, very gutsy and very, very like primal in that phase. And therefore you see participation that do not have explanation perhaps. So yeah, so but again I think violence questions is very, very huge questions for me. And I think like of course it is becoming with different kinds of political kinds of like formation, it is becoming very contemporary. But I think perhaps like we need to go to that kinds of like very, we need to get out of this very idealized idea of the myth music, that like epic and all kinds of things that also inherently carry some forms of violence.
Yeah, I, there is a question to Brahm, that examples of resisting Brahminical appropriation of local traditions, festivals, and cultures in the recent past. What were the modes of resistance?
Again
Any?
like it's a huge.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Yeah, of course, like it has lot to do, like, so one cannot give it like a one, two sentence answer. It is like, different regions have different spectrum. So either you are thinking about Tamil Nadu, then it unfolded in a different way. And since we are also discussing about Ramayana, different other kinds of myth, then the intervention by Periyar and the way he was taking this myth. So that was one kinds of like answer. But also now you have like whole new generation of artists. They are trying to do in a different way. Paranjit, others people are doing in a different way. So I think it needs to have a more like regional kinds of like thinking about that, how they are responding. Many times we go to Punjab, then Ravi Dasiyas are able to provide different kinds of answer, and Bihar it's a different answer. So I think it has more regional kinds of variations than one national kinds of rubric in which one can think about this resistance. So it's like pockets in which resistance are emerging in a different way. But yes, it is also like quite things that is like still in process of formation and like reimagination perhaps.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing about this violence part. One of the things which I've been spending time thinking about is, violence. One of the core things which Arshia also referred to was the other aspect of it. Like to constitute who I am, you need to other someone on the outside to shape the inside. This kind of process. Myth is a very important component, or cultural work itself in a broader sense is important because it's suturing past and present. It's suturing Hindu, Muslim in these kind of relationships, inside, outside, or like these kind of things. So, because of that, I think one of the things which myth should be able to do is to like reconfigure this whole identification processes, whether it's the retelling of an existing one or it's like digging up myths that have entered zombie state, subterranean or dormant, latent, whatever word you want to,
Sorry.
there's some kind of reactivation of those myths, or like creation of new ones, like you were saying, the Fulan Devi kind of things also. But the problem is they have varying affective capacities, and also the economy question comes that who will promote which kind of narratives. But in any case, I think one of the issues also with this kind of a conversation is it's increasing in its complexity and a spoken format. It's difficult to keep track, like, so many things. So I'm glad this is on YouTube so people can go back and revisit some of the things. But also, I mean, hope that some of these things can be pursued either by both of you individually in your own writings, or maybe if we can facilitate an exchange or a written version of this, then I think, some of that complexity can be addressed when you don't have to respond immediately, right?
Oh,
Uh,
Yeah.
you go.
yeah.
Promise.
Yeah.
In any case, run for nearly 2 hours, so I think we'll bring it to a close. So thank you very, very much to Arshia,
Thank you.
to Brahm, and thank you for the audiences who've been listening very attentively for the whole almost 2 hours. And hopefully, we'll put up a written version of this in some form at a future time. So thank you once again, and see you all soon.
Thank you, Arshia, and thank you, Ram, and thank you, team members, Team Mara, for organizing this. It's really sheer honor.
Thank you. Thanks.